to about what's relevant in the right area.
Thank you all so much for coming on what is a nice, warm spring day. Summer day. My name is Alan Walnuts. I am the managing director of a company called the YIMBY Initiative. We are a research centre and stakeholder engagement partner. We are a secretariat-led growth group. We've been doing quite a lot of the low-income housing tax credit over the last few years, which is a policy that you shall hear a lot more about over the next hour. We've got some fantastic guests here, which I'm delighted to say we managed to put together. Finally, I'd like to welcome President of the RICS, Nick, to the stage. Thank you very much.
We were just having a debate as to whether we're called the RICS or RICS bar, and it depends how the evening goes, I suspect. I'm Nick McLean, and I'm the acting president of the RICS, and I'm delighted to be here this evening. And welcome to this very historic building. I should tell you it's the only privately held building in Parliament Square, because we like to be very close to the lawmakers, so we can nip across the grass. Tonight we have two very important guests with us to talk about an issue which is, I think, close to everybody's heart for the fact that you've come to this evening's debate. The first is Chris Curtis, the Labour MP for Milton Keynes North, and importantly a member of the, well, look at this to get this right, the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. And second, we have Shaun Donovan, who's the President and CEO of the Enterprise Community Partners and the former Secretary of the US Department of Housing and Urban Development under President Obama. So we've got some very high-powered conversation coming up, and I'll allow them to introduce their backgrounds a little bit later. But if I may paraphrase and give you a comparison of the two gentlemen on why they share so much in common, it seems to me that they believe that, and as do I, that the provision of housing is a national duty, and a duty which can deliver not just a basic human right, but also a driver for economic growth, wherever that comes, an opportunity for an extraction from poverty, and a clear path for prosperity going forward. So it has a critical impact on people's lives and on the workplace and on our joint economies. I heard Chris speak at UK Reef in Leeds a few days ago, and I'm sure he will touch upon the importance of new towns in the strategy for delivering new prosperity to some parts of the UK. And for Shaun, who, as well as his job under the President, also worked for Michael Bloomberg, looking at housing recovery schemes in New York. Very important lessons to be learned, which I think are being imparted on us today. You may have seen that figures released last week by the House Building Federation show that the number of new home starts in the UK in the first quarter of this year was the lowest since 2012, and the third lowest statistic since records began for this particular survey in 2006. So it's a big issue, an issue recognised by the government, but an issue we don't quite have the solution to yet. But it will take a combination and collaboration between all parties to come to the right solution. And that's why this YIMBY initiative tonight is very, very important. And you may deduce that this is a transatlantic issue. It's absolutely not. It's an issue which is affecting all parts of the world. I've lived for the last 20 odd years in the Middle East, and it's as big as issue there as it is here in the US. So gentlemen, please come to the stage and give us your knowledge. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you for joining us here this evening. I'd sort of prepared to do a bit more of an introduction, but I don't have anything more to add to that introduction. Before we start, I'll just touch on 2 points which I think are particularly relevant to the conversation this evening that is happening here in London, which is just before I walked over here to, thankfully not a particularly long distance, this evening, I voted for the 3rd reading in the House of Commons for the fantastic planning and infrastructure bill, which we managed to get passed despite the best efforts of the Tories, Greens, and a NIMBY called Chris Hinchcliffe. Which is obviously going to ensure that we can continue building the homes and infrastructure that Britain so desperately needs. And more excitingly, as I was walking around doing the third reading, as I was walking around the voting lobbies, we'll come on to this in a minute, weird concept. As I was walking around the voting lobbies...
Do you mean it's weird that you actually read the bills you're about to vote on? That would be weird in the US.
Yeah, no, that I don't think happens across the board. What's weird is we have to keep this walking around in circles thing. But there's one big benefit to the walking around in circles thing we have to do while we pass laws in the UK, which is that I did manage to grab the Deputy Prime Minister and get her to sign a copy of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which I'll give to the person who asked the best question in a Q&A at the end. So if that's an incentive to ask, if that's not an incentive to ask a question, I don't know what is. And secondly, obviously, we have the spending review tomorrow. We are expecting some news very shortly on the relevance for housing, and particularly social housing, which we're hoping is going to be good news in the coming hours, which is obviously really important and what we're here to talk about this evening. So I think we'll talk a bit about US politics, where things are going, the abundance agenda, housing policy, and particularly the LIHTC model that you wanted to discuss. But I think, firstly, the most important question that came to my mind was, in 2010, what was it like to be the designated survivor?
So I'm sorry Kiefer Sutherland isn't here to answer that question. In fact, I was the designated survivor. I think for this audience, I could suffice to just say it was the single greatest James Bond moment of my life. And I will say I was quite surprised a couple years after I had done that. I was, again, if I could, there's a limited amount I could tell you without having to kill everyone in the audience. So with that qualification, I did have the nuclear football with me in the mountain. Post 9/11, this is something the US government takes very, very seriously. And it was quite remarkable to have an entire government in waiting, literally in a mountain, not that far from Washington, D.C. I was a little surprised when the not one but two helicopters came to pick me up. When I asked them in a real situation where this had to happen, whether I could bring my wife and kids along or whether they'd have to fend for themselves, they did say, well, I'm sorry, I don't think we'll have room on the helicopter. So that was a little bit of a tough conversation when I got home. But I was quite surprised more than a year afterwards when one of my kids came to say, Dad, have you seen there's a television show about you? And sure enough, Kiefer Sutherland, a HUD secretary who trained as an architect, ends up being the president of the United States. Yeah. So that was a little bit of a surprise. I got no royalties, I should say, and I'm not...
Well, thankfully, most of it didn't happen.
Right.
And I'm not... the first 10 minutes, thankfully, that was based on anecdotal experience.
Exactly. Exactly. So...
Yes. Okay. And would you have chosen Kiefer Sutherland to have played you, or was there any other fictional? We will get onto housing policy.
I was thinking George Clooney, of course, but
no, indeed. And just the other thing, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the idea of walking around the voting lobbies. Obviously, you've been right at the top of US politics. You know, being in the White House, and then you've spent the last 24 hours. Here in the UK, you've been in our Parliament building, met many of our MPs, been in Downing Street today, I think, as well, meeting some of our policy advisors there. How does it feel, sort of being in the kind of British institutions compared to being in the US institutions? Does the culture and feel very different? Do you feel the history differently?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I answer it in part, you know, I spent a lot of time as a kid growing up here. I actually went to kindergarten here. My dad's British. I'm a dual national. And so there was something quite familiar and reassuring about it. I will also say to be serious for a moment, at a time when public servants are being undermined and even denigrated in the US, described in ways that are fundamentally attacking not just what they do, but who they are. I am always amazed to see the quality of people, yourself and others, who will step up to public service. And I do think we're at a time where public service has never been more important. We'll talk about housing tonight, but in a broad set, our institutions, we are losing faith in them, and we need the best and the brightest to be able to serve and to be willing to serve. And it was reassuring to see that walking those halls.
It's fantastic to hear you say that, despite the fact that you've even met some Conservatives today as well. I will touch on it. I find this kind of interesting comparison between the US and UK, but just sort of starting off just on this point on the US. Where do you think the US is heading right now? How do you feel about it? What gives you a sense of optimism about the future, despite, many of the political differences I'm sure you have? Or does anything give you a level of optimism?
Yeah.
Despite, I'm sure, the political differences you have about, what's happening in the US government.
Yeah. So I would say that to do the kind of work that we've done, you have to be an optimist in some ways. I have a sister who was a psychiatrist who described me as a malignant optimist, completely incurable. So, but I will say I am concerned about where we are headed, where our politics is headed. And I see two quite different paths that we could go down. I would describe Donald Trump as both a cause and a symptom of our politics. And he has certainly, in many ways, inflamed tensions and divisions. There are some places where I agree with what he's doing, but largely I am concerned about the direction he's taking the country. But fundamentally, looking beyond him or any single individual, we are, as a country, but I also think in much of the world, we are seeing an inability of institutions and a loss of faith in institutions to be able to solve big problems. And housing is front and center in that, but it is not alone in that problem. And the more we get into a vicious cycle of losing faith in those institutions, electing those who don't believe in them, and not being able to build a constructive consensus around doing big things as a country, as around the globe, the more this can become self-reinforcing. And just a particular aspect of the way to think about it in the US, and I think housing is very much part of this. We are increasingly living not just in our social media bubbles, but in our actual physical bubbles, right? And those who disagree with you are increasingly becoming the enemy. You don't want to live with them. You don't want to be near them. But we are also seeing, as our politics increasingly divide along economic and class lines, we're seeing that in the US very much, right? That more and more the Democratic Party is becoming a party of highly educated elites. The Republican Party is becoming more and more a party of lower educational attainment, blue-collar workers. What we are also seeing is that housing costs are reinforcing that, right? That if you're able to get access to a good education, if you're able to get access to a good job, you can move to where the opportunity is. And today in the US, as a result of that, we are more politically polarized in our geography than we have been since the Civil War, right? I was looking at this as we were getting ready to come up. You have to go back to before the very first president of the RICS in 1868 to find a time when the US, when Democrats and Republicans were more likely to live with each other than they are today. And think about that. We had a country that was at war with itself, where almost by definition, if you lived in the South, you were a one political alignment. If you lived in the North, you have to go back to that time to find a time when it is more difficult to find somebody who believes differently from you living in your neighborhood. And the more we reinforce that, not just on social media, but in terms of who we see and who we talk to every day, I think the more danger we have of continuing ahead down a path where we lose faith in government, and not just government, losing faith in all institutions, right? The private sector, religion, and that's the thing that concerns me most. As a malignant optimist, I do have to come back to the other part of your question, which is
yes, we need the optimism.
What gives me hope?
Yeah.
And it is this really interesting, strange bedfellows coalition that's emerging around, whether you call it the YIMBY movement, the abundance movement, whatever label you want to put on it. There is a very interesting, very diverse coalition, everything from libertarians to racial justice advocates, who are coming together to say, we've got to do big things, and we've got to get out of our own way in some cases to do those big things. And I think that for me is quite interesting. I just a little anecdote about that. I was in a camper van visiting a bunch of the national parks in the US, and I went to see the very conservative governor of Montana, Greg Gianforte. So here I was in my camper van, putting on my tie to go. I walk in, first of all, his office had more dead animals than any room I've been in my life. But he had just led the passage of legislation in the state legislature in Montana that eliminated single-family zoning. In other words, by right, anybody in the state could put a second unit on their piece of land, no matter what the local government might say. And he had eliminated basically all parking requirements in the entire state of Montana. And I said to him, Governor, what's the politics for you of pissing off every one of your mayors, every one of your local county commissioners? He said, it's a freedom agenda. This is about property owners having the right to develop their property, right? And anytime you get somebody who's, been the housing secretary for President Obama agreeing with, or people to my left agreeing with the very far right libertarian governor of Montana, you have an interesting coalition to actually get big things done.
Really interesting point. I think we notice this increasingly here in the UK as well. The sort of there's people in every political party in the representative parliament that very much, apart from the Greens, who sign up to this agenda. And then there's
just had to stick that in there.
There's not many Greens. I'm sure there's some in the Green Party, and then there's many in a small number in my political party, most in the Conservative Party. But there's obviously a correlation. But it's interesting how I will, on some of these issues, have a lot more in common with the Conservative, or even someone like some of the Richard Tice from the Reform Party might have more in common with me on some of these questions than I do with some people in my own party, despite the fact that I couldn't agree on him with anything else. It really is interesting the way those new coalitions are forming over some of these. And it makes sense, right? I mean, why is it that the kind of historical divides that you maybe drove you into being a Republican and Democrat on abortion or gun control, why is it that would correlate with views on house building or whatever else we're moving into? No, I think it's interesting.
I will say, just on the environmental point, and Ezra Klein writes about this in Abundance, we've seen it. One of the things that is calling that division into question is the ability to reach our renewable energy goals, right? And this is true in the US, but I was recently in Germany looking at their wind industry. Most of their power from wind is produced in the North Sea. Most of their population is the South. They have a huge issue around NIMBYism to be able to move the power. We have that. The siting, the ability to look at environmental regulations, to streamline them, to be able. There are more and more climate groups in the U.S. that are understanding this issue. I would also say, I give Mike Bloomberg a lot of credit. When he was mayor, we were the first city in the globe to have a really well-developed climate plan for the city. It was called Plan YC. And one of the things we really emphasized is that the most sustainable way you can possibly live is in a dense place. And that if you are for reducing carbon emissions, you should be for density. You should be for building more and clearly allowing you to build density in places that are near transit and other things. That will leave more land for conservation and nature. So there are clearly going to be places where we conflict, but I'm also seeing that there are places where we can start to bring environmentalists along.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. And it was interesting in the Commons for the passing of this. And a big part of this is about ensuring we can build renewable infrastructure in a country that 2 years ago, Ukraine was building more onshore wind turbines than we were building here in the UK. It's just how difficult we made it to build green infrastructure projects. It was interesting to see that debate play out, to see the sort of NIMBY green people versus the YIMBY green people, and that debate really starting to, and obviously I'm in the latter category, but that debate really starting to hammer home. But ultimately, you've got people who claim to be green and pro the environment, opposing solar farms, opposing wind turbines, and not realising the damage that that's going to do the climate change to the environment, and us trying to fight back on that, and a new coalition that's being built around that. But it's only by fixing a lot of these institutions that we can ensure or the Greens in Germany blocking nuclear power. Nuclear power was obviously a big part of this as well. It's only with nuclear energy that you can start to bring down carbon emissions. Just on you talked a bit, as we talked there about the interesting politics around this and that giving us a sense of hope. Also talked a bit about how sort of our politics, social media, everything else has caused people to lose faith in institutions. I think that's true. I think part of what has also led to people losing faith in our institutions is that our institutions have got a bit crap.
To use the technical term.
Yeah. Well, that was me toning myself down. But it is our politicians that got our planning system into this mess. And you said it's not just housing. That's true. All of our institutions, particularly here in the UK, I think we felt it since coming into government over the last 12 months. But I'm sure it's true in the US as well. It's felt like they've got themselves into this kind of mess that works against, let's call it, the abundance agenda. And that's why you need this kind of, that's why Ezra Klein's book, I think, has been so powerful and reached that moment, because many people in government, but also people who watch government, look at it and think, how has it got itself into this mess? So I think it is politics, is it politics and politicians that have got our institutions to this point, or is there something else? What's caused us to reach the point where the institutions do work against growth?
Yeah, we could spend the whole night on this subject. It's so interesting, and it's not simple, right? It's a combination of things. I do think that we who have worked in government, who have been part of the political process, have to take some blame for not focusing enough on governing, focusing too much on the politics. And certainly social media and other things, we can blame it on those things. But at the end of the day, and I do think, I was lucky enough to work in Mike Bloomberg and in Barack Obama for folks who were very focused on choosing people and focusing on delivering, building around results. But I think we don't do enough of that. And every leader who steps into one of these positions has to take on that responsibility to not just promise, but actually deliver on those promises. I would also say that some of the sort of regulatory challenges have built up for the right reasons, but have gone too far. And I will just personally, I grew up in New York City in the 1960s and 70s. I don't know how many of you have read The Power Broker by Robert Caro, or looked at the history of urban renewal in the US, which many nicknamed Negro removal, for literally the kind of systematic way that low-income communities were demolished and redeveloped, and huge populations displaced. And so, for us, we often talk about the Robert Moses versus Jane Jacobs divide. Jane Jacobs was the protester who, literally lay down on the streets and would not let Robert Moses bulldoze her neighborhood and build a giant new highway on the west side of Manhattan, right? And we've seen the damage that those kind of mega infrastructure projects can do. And typically it's those with the least political power that stand up, that are unable to stand up to that. And that's where those big projects go. So there is a history we have to recognize of victimizing particularly low-income communities of color, that much of, in our case, the Democratic Party, but let's say liberals, have stood for. And that was often what to stand against rather than what to be for. And I think one of the things, Ezra Klein does a great job of sort of plumbing this history in his book, but I've seen it very personally, and I will say I myself am torn about that tension. You want to have more voices, more diverse voices involved in conversations. But when having many voices, many conversations leads to inaction, then you have to ask yourself, at what cost, right? And that is a fundamental tension in governing that I think we all have to be sensitive to, but we do have to recognize that we've ended up in a place where if a single person can stop a project that is in the public good moving forward, you have to ask hard questions about how to change that system.
I think I agree with that, and get stuck in this argument often about regulation good, regulation bad, and I think it's the problem. I think it's two problems. Firstly, our regulation, we never sort of try and hierarchy. We never go, here are the real ills that we need to avoid, but we can't stop everything all of the time. And this sort of everythingism, there's a brilliant essay that's been written by a think tank here about everythingism and how our regulation, it's particularly obvious in the planning system, and I've literally just had to vote down an amendment on balconies. It's just the level of insanity. But through our regulatory system, there will be people that try to make everything the government does, try and solve every problem all of the time in the whole of society. And obviously because of that, we end up achieving nothing. The planning system has to solve the social housing crisis, build all of the infrastructure, these are good things. But then you get onto, and then every house has to have this exact environmental regulation and fix this problem. And then eventually the list is so long that nothing gets done. Yeah. And it's about thinking how we can have a more grown-up conversation where we can allow flexibility and correctly hierarchy the problems that we want to fix through our regulation, rather than just over-regulating everything out of existence.
I would also say, just to make it a little more personal, that this comes back to the point about what responsibility do we as leaders who have been in the public sector or in the public sector in setting the right tone on this. So just a story, I was talking to a couple folks out of drinks earlier. I was sitting with Mike Bloomberg at dinner one night, and after a few drinks, he turned to me and said, "You know what, Donovan, you know what the problem with government is? I take a guy at my company who is a rock star. 3 out of 10 of his ideas are home runs. That's a person I promote. And most importantly, I take money away from the 7 things that aren't working, and I put them towards the 3 that are. If I take that exact same person and I put them in government, they probably get fired because one of the 7 things that goes wrong ends up on the front page of the New York Post. Yeah. And most importantly, I have to take money away from the 3 things that are working and put them towards the 7 that aren't." Yeah. Now, recognize that government is a monopoly. And if one of those 7 things is kids dying in foster care, you got to fix it, right? So we shouldn't equate the private sector and the public sector. But there's a fundamental truth in what he was saying, is that we are so focused on not getting a bad story, not taking risk, and often the 1% of things that goes wrong leads to us legislating and making changes that make it much harder to do the 99% of the time things are going right. And finish the story by saying that takes leadership, that we should be taking risks, that making mistakes isn't fatal in government. Everybody makes mistakes, right? The first time I really screwed something up as housing commissioner in New York, I got a call on my cell phone from Mike Bloomberg. I didn't get calls from him that often. I was nervous. And he asked me 3 questions about what had happened. And at the end of that conversation, he said, "Do it again, Shaun." I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Mayor, I just screwed this up." He said, "You were trying to do something new for the right reasons. Keep doing that." And that is very hard in our political system, where a bad story drives you to, introduce a piece of legislation that deals with that 1% of things, the balcony law, perhaps, that you were talking about. That's very hard to do as a political leader, but it's really important.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about, I'm still fairly new to this, right? But I spend so much time thinking about the incentives there is on me as a politician, and often how bad they are, and or how they drive you to do things that I don't think are helpful,
right?
And what we need to change within our political system, and how we can do that. So actually, the incentives on everyone is to be more constructive, and to work more towards an agenda that is ultimately serving the interests of the people that sent us to that place.
Yeah.
And too often it doesn't feel like that, and that's a constant sense of frustration that we have to grapple with. And ultimately, it's just leadership that it's going to be the only thing that gets us out of that. And hopefully, we've got the government pushing in. Well, we have got the government pushing back in that direction again now. Now, I mean, pretty impressive career, reading through all of your bio earlier. You've talked about New York and, the federal government. What's the one thing you'd say you're proudest of achieving when you were in office? Across any of it?
Well, part of what's hard about government is that you get very little credit for avoiding what could have gone worse, or to fixing things that have gone off the rails, right? And
it's what the Home Secretary in this country has said for years. It's basically the Home Office.
Yes, it is. And just to flash back for when I stepped in to be HUD Secretary, Lehman Brothers collapsed in the late summer of 2008. The mortgage crisis mushroomed in the US. And at about the time I was crazy enough to agree to becoming housing secretary, we had about 10 million homeowners on the verge of foreclosure in the US. And the housing finance system in the US, which is the largest financial market in the world, because housing is so expensive, because we finance so much housing in the US, it is the single largest financial market. That had literally caused your economy and just about every other economy.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yours has managed to recover since then, ours hasn't.
That was part of the plan.
Yeah.
So I would have to say, as hard as it was, as many mistakes as we made, the ability to heal that crisis has to be up there, but it was brutal. And we don't get a lot of credit for it. I would argue that our housing market, our economy healed faster than most across the globe, but it was deeply, deeply painful. So I don't know if pride is the right, but it is clearly something that I spent an enormous amount of blood, sweat, and tears on, and I do think we got at least some things right. The other thing I would just say, because there are many things that we worked on But I began working in housing because I grew up in New York, because I saw more and more of my neighbors sleeping on the streets around me. Asked myself how, in the wealthiest city in the wealthiest country on earth, I could have neighbors sleeping on the streets. I started volunteering at a homeless shelter in college, worked in homelessness and affordable housing after finishing school, and to become housing secretary and lead the national strategy around homelessness. When I started, a veteran in the US was twice as likely to become homeless as an average American. Think about that. Somebody who served your country, twice as likely to end up on the streets. And with President Obama's leadership, with Michelle Obama's leadership, Joe Biden, Jill Biden, we all agreed that that was something we needed to fix. And by the time we were finished, we had cut veteran homelessness in half nationally. We had over 100 cities and states that ended veteran homelessness. Not reduced it, but ended it. And for me, it's particularly powerful. Homelessness is up 30% in the United States in the last 2 years alone. Think about that. 30% in 2 years, which is heartbreaking to me. But I would submit that seeing a human being sleeping on the street is the most visible form of the failure of government that there is. Because it is so visible, it is so morally compelling and disturbing that, especially when you see the kind of increases we've seen in the US, and I think you're seeing some increases here. Obviously, you haven't reached anywhere near the scale that we have, but it is hard to believe that your government is working when you see that. And so I felt fundamentally that we weren't just solving the problem of homelessness, but we were trying to get to what we were talking about earlier, which was to demonstrate that government can actually work in solving the most pressing problems that we face in our real lives. And I see more and more Americans who not just are angry about their government failing them, not just angry that we have this terrible situation, but fundamentally believing that government doesn't work because they're seeing this. And so for me, that was emblematic and critical in terms of showing that we could be effective.
I think it's fairly similar for many of us. I think someone was saying yesterday, it's now 1 in every 22 children in London living in temporary accommodation, like 1 in every classroom. 1 in every 22 children in London growing up in temporary accommodation. We've had nearly 200 children die when that has been designated as being because of the accommodation, the temporary accommodation they were growing up with, half of them under the age of 1. And
look, this is why we care about housing, because that kid that grows up in that situation, moving from school to school, unable to find a quiet place to do their homework. The awful one I heard the other day, not learning to walk or crawl because they haven't got the space in the room to learn to walk or crawl. And so the cost to that person, to that family, to society, is a fundamental reason why we need to invest in housing, right? It pays back whatever fiscal costs there may be over and over again because of the impact housing has on every other phase of life, on health, on education, employment. And more because we now have the data to show that, I think it is part of the reason why more and more, there's more bipartisan support for housing.
So we're hoping for some good news tomorrow. in the UK. And
I'm hearing rumbles that it's encouraging.
yes, I'm not going to break an embargo, but we're expecting good news tomorrow. I think what we're always conscious of, we talk about the extra money for affordable housing as much as we like. We can talk about the 1.5 million housing target. What I'm always conscious of in this debate is that every single target we have is both ambitious, which is what many in the industry would say is, maybe should have been a bit lower, shouldn't it, if you want to be confident of hitting it by the next election. Ambitious, whilst at the same time not being sufficient. So one of the things, particularly in the affordable housing sector, I think about is it doesn't matter how much money we can get out of the Treasury tomorrow, it's still not going to be enough in order to build enough affordable homes. We are going to have to think about other models in order to make it work. Now, one of the ones you've got in the US, which some have suggested we could move over to into the UK and think about how that can support our affordable housing sector here, is the low income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. People here call it LIHTC. Do you call it LIHTC in the US?
Yeah, I would call it LIHTC, but we were having a conversation earlier and used the term LIHTC, and somebody said, "Oh, I work on lighting too." So I'll call it the low-income housing tax credit.
Okay, well,
or the tax credit.
Well, okay, we'll go for tax credit. I mean, it's going to get burdensome quick into this conversation, I think, if we keep repeating the entire title. Do you want to let us know how it works, and then we'll talk about whether we think it's something that we could move over to the UK?
Yeah. So first, I would say, and this really echoes the point you just made, we need an all-of-the-above strategy, right? And that means zoning and regulatory reform, doing everything we can to allow more housing to be built for all the reasons we talked about earlier. But specifically, we have to make sure that we're building homes at rents that people can afford. Generally, we add new stock at the top of the market. It's the way the sort of filtering system in housing works. And if we're going to make progress in the short term and kind of build momentum around this, we have to be adding supply at all different levels. And what we've found in the US, after decades of trying different things and not either finding success or building the political support, we created in 1986 a tax incentive to build new affordable housing that has been our longest standing and most successful housing program in history. It has more bipartisan support than we've ever seen. It has a success rate that is far higher than anything else that we've done. And so very specifically, we moved from a system very much like your council housing originally, we called it public housing. Those projects still exist, although there are fewer and fewer of them, but we're not building any new ones. And basically that is government-owned and supported housing through direct grants. And what we found over time is both that there was some mismanagement. We had some very good local housing authorities, but we also had some ones that really failed in the task. But what we also found is that the only real supporters politically of that program were residents of that housing and those that administered it. And over decades, the funding for that program has declined to the point where, very similar to council housing here, there are huge repair needs. There's over $120 billion of capital repair needs in our public housing in the US right now. And so people are living in inhumane conditions in public housing in many places across the country. We also started, when that program started to have failures, created a for-profit private sector incentive, basically a rent subsidy and construction grants that went to private owners. We said, oh, well, the private sector will fix it. That program had its deep challenges as well. So in reaction to all of that, we had a bipartisan group that came together and basically said, we're going to create a system that's relatively limited bureaucracy. We're going to award tax credits to projects where a private entity who needs to pay taxes can come in, invest in that project, and in return, get 10 years of tax breaks from investing in that housing. And what it has done is create an aligned incentive, government, but also the private sector, to make sure that project is built. For one reason, because the government doesn't turn on those tax credits until the project has been completely built and occupied by people who are income eligible at lower rents. And so what that means is we are paying for success, right? That we are ensuring that the government only pays when the project is completed and rented up. There is private capital at risk, just like in a traditional housing development, right? It's a private developer who takes the risk of construction quality, all those things. That's the same in the low-income housing tax credit. But equally important, the stick, right, that really makes sure the quality stays is that at any time over the 15-year compliance period, the government can take back the tax credit, right? Impossible to take back a grant from a nonprofit builder or others, right? But very possible to basically say, okay, we're now going to increase your tax bill, right? To offset that credit you were given if there's noncompliance. So fundamentally what it does is create very strong incentives. And as a result, we have literally just a few basis points of properties that fail under the program, dramatically lower than any other way of investing in affordable housing that we've had over time. I think the other thing I would say is that you are also not adding to the public debt, right? You are creating an obligation over 10 years against future tax payments, but you are not having to go and borrow today to be able to invest in these projects with a grant. And that particularly, we have debt to GDP that's approaching 1, which is historically high levels. You do as well.
I think we've hit it, haven't we? This is behind us now.
This is very, we're in dangerous territory on the debt level. And I think we have to recognize that and find creative new ways to fund what is an urgent need.
Yeah, we're thinking about how this works in practice is interesting. But I think there's two things that are appealing about this. Firstly, and how it translates to the UK. Firstly, look, because we have a much more generous housing benefit system than you. I think we're spending more on housing costs in the UK now than we ever have before. But it's not built on capital projects and spending and more houses and council homes. It is effectively built on a housing benefit bill, which is going to subsidise accommodation that in most cases is too expensive. So actually we know that building more affordable social homes will pay for itself over a window that is slightly longer, well, notably longer than the OBR would ever look at. So making it work within our fiscal rules, ensuring that we can put enough money in is always going to be difficult. So trying to spread that cost out over a period of time where the benefit is felt is a challenge that I think this can help us with. I mean, the second problem we've got, where I think this is particularly interesting, is we've got a real problem. I mean, you talked about public housing. Our market's a bit further along than that. Yeah, we've got social housing providers right across the board, but a lot of the current ones are not looking at the moment at taking on new stock because all of their focus is, rightly, in my opinion,
at the time it would be most important to them to build new housing. They are not doing that
because they're rightly focusing on ensuring that their older stock is getting up to standard. So how do we get new entrants into the market in order to ensure that new stock can be taken on and supported? This could be something that can potentially help with that.
Absolutely. And look, I would say, first of all, I don't want to skate past this. Hopefully you can learn from us in terms of the low-income housing tax credit, but whatever challenges your housing benefit may have, I want to congratulate you and wish that we in the US had a similar system. Because to go back to the introduction tonight, we do, I certainly do, and I think most people in this room would agree that housing is a right. And yet, unlike you in the United States, literally for every family that actually gets our equivalent of a housing benefit, whether it's a housing voucher or some other form of rental assistance, there are 3 other families that are income qualified and get nothing. And so the fact that you have a national commitment. And, we always used to say when I was budget director, you want to know my values? Look at my budget, right? And we do not do what you do in making that available. But I would argue that will make a low-income housing tax credit program work better in the UK than it would in the US, because even if you subsidize every single dollar of building a home, you still have to operate that home, right? And for very low-income people, covering what would be the maintenance, the utilities, the insurance, all those things, they can't do that on their salaries, right? So you do need something else. And one of the biggest criticisms of the low-income housing tax credit is employing that alone doesn't get you down to the truly lowest income. We find 20% of the housing we do with the low-income housing tax credit in my organization goes for formerly homeless people. So there are ways to make it work, but you've got to have a rental support that goes with the capital subsidy, and having a housing benefit allows you to do that. What it also means, just putting my budget hat on, is you will lower your costs of your housing benefit, because on average, our low-income housing tax credit units are 38% below market. So you will take people who are renting at market and put them in units that you as government will need to spend a lot less on if you develop a system like this. I would also just say, this system is very flexible. We can use it for for-profit owners, but you can also use it for nonprofit owners. You can use it for government owners, housing associations. Anybody can use it. The tax benefit has to go to a limited partner who is a tax-paying entity, a for-profit in the US, but anybody can be the general partner, the developer of the property, and it can be used for new construction or renovation. So you could have housing associations who not only use it to take care of the repair needs, they could also use it to develop new properties at the same time. So it's not just about bringing new entrants. It would bring new entrants, but it would also help your traditional providers get back to the point where they can build housing.
And having that stick as well, to be able to pull the tax credit away later if it doesn't meet a standard as well, can help. Ensure we avoid some of the problems that we have faced in the sector.
And look, I mean,
substandard accommodation.
Just to be blunt, that can be scary to traditional folks who are used to using the grant system. Yeah. That might be a scary thing, to have that potential for enforcement. But in the long run, what we've seen in our system is that it has created incentives and really driven the production of much higher quality housing. And frankly, that's started to restore faith in these programs. We've never had as broad a political coalition as supports the housing tax credit in any program. We have a tax bill that just went through the House of Representatives at an intensely partisan time. The single most bipartisan piece of it was a 12.5% increase in the low-income housing tax credit. So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, in seeing the political support.
Now having more people lobbying for social housing and affordable housing certainly would be a good thing for this country after what we've seen over the last decade. Right, I've asked too many questions, we've gone on too long. So remember the prize that's at stake here? It's Angela Rayner's signature on a very long piece of legislation, but a good one. So any questions? Oh, good. We'll take 3 at a time, shall we? Do you want to take a pick? Go on. Introduce who you are.
Hi, I'm Ellen Stringer. I'm the Deputy Leader of Burton Council in South West London, and also a trustee of London Housing Foundation, a homeless charity. Firstly, you talked about the Greens being NIMBYs. Can I give an honourable mention to Lib Dems?
Yeah.
See, the Mercer Wimbledon, they're absolutely expert at whipping up that NIMBY card, but then claiming credit when something good happens. And my question is that I'm interested to hear from either of you if you know of any project schemes where there was initially local community opposition, but where the case was able to be put to them and there was a change in public mood. So not just where it got approved, but where there was a change in public mood, and if so, how was that message got across?
We'll take them in 3, shall we? I'm not going to try and do Dimbleby and describe you in a...
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Marlon and I work for Working Council, Council Consultancy. You talked about Gianforte and the Montana miracle, where he successfully got planning reform through across the political divide. That's not been the experience of every governor in the US. Where you're from in New York, Kathy Hochul failed miserably to get
The housing compact. Yep.
and she faces quite similar politics to some of our cities in the UK, like London, where there are affluent, largely Republican voters in the suburban areas that are very unwilling to support planning reform. And we have that here in suburban London and in the Greenbelt. And I was just wondering if you could give some advice to Kathy Hochul or to our mayor here, Steve Khan, or Keir Starmer, on how you can form those coalitions to overcome these issues. What would that advice be?
Brilliant. That was one of my remaining questions as well, so I'm glad you've asked that.
Thank you. My question for Secretary Donovan, of course, you can weigh in. You're talking about an all of the above approach, and I remember a conversation I had with a mayor of like a big city, and she was saying something similar, saying, I'm just throwing things to the board and seeing what sticks, deregulating one sector, regulating another, zoning transformation. But you also talk about this approach to balance social justice, climate conscience, at the same time that you need to provide affordable housing. Do you have any idea what would be the sweet spot? Would you have any recommendation for this country about how to find that sweet spot from the experience and for you now working across Parliament Square? Have you had any conversations about what would be the sweet spot? And if I may, Angela Rayner is literally my lock screen. Nicely.
What was your name? You got to say your name to be in it.
John Bailey.
John?
John Marcus Bailey.
So, I mean, would you say Angela Rayner is your lock screen?
Yes.
So sort of views generally on how we politically get through some of those pro-building issues, I think, there.
Yeah, so all of these questions in different waves, I think, revolve around, sweet spot, models where it's worked, and the politics around this. I would be the last to underestimate the politics of this. In my very first community board meeting as housing commissioner in New York City, I needed to be protected by police for the radical idea that we should have tall buildings in New York City, right? So what I have seen, I would say Montana is, as you imply, sort of at one end of the spectrum and unusual in how quickly things got done. The basic sort of political evolution of this is what you see is mayors, governors, national leaders coming in with a big proposal that goes down in flames, and then the following year, 2 to 3 incremental proposals that get done, and then the following year, maybe 2 or 3 more. We've gotten 8 bills, my team working with Jared Polis in Colorado, done over the last few sessions. California, after some very hard starts, has started to make progress. New York, actually, after the housing compact, Hochul's housing compact went down in flames, came back and got 2 or 3 relatively small things done. So one fundamental thing is you have to build the political coalitions and the stamina for the long term. You have to be prepared to keep coming back and not take initial resistance or defeat as a no. I also think there's always been, but particularly in this climate, it is so easy to demonize, to kind of have conspiracy theories about what this is going to be. And the stories about, they're going to put a skyscraper in, next to my single family home, or, you can go, and very often part of what initial incremental progress does is start to put a lie to that, right? Is to show people that seeing is believing. So in general, and I am for where you have the political kind of stars aligned, like in Montana, to go for the big thing. But I think what we've seen is that there are a set of changes that can be the sort of leading edge of reform. Those are things, we call it gentle density, what we call accessory dwelling units, right? Allow people to convert their garages, allow people to build a new unit in their backyard. For single family homeowners, they say, oh, like I could increase my value for that. Or I have a mother-in-law or my elderly parent who can live there. And what's interesting about this is people tend to think, oh, well, is that really going to make change? We just did a study, my research team, of what's happened in Los Angeles. Just the increase in building permits for that have gotten done, not a theoretical increase, but actually increase in building permits in LA because of their accessory dwelling unit change. If every community in the United States did that, it would be over 9 million units of new housing. We think our gap in the US is 7 million units. So this is real change. We have a lot of low density neighborhoods, as you do. So that's one that we would lead with. We do a lot of work on YIGBY. What the hell is YIGBY, you might ask? Yes, in God's backyard. We work with churches, synagogues, mosques all over the United States who want to develop housing, but are stopped by zoning codes or other things. It's amazing what a religiously based initiative can do in terms of bipartisanship.
Okay, I'm stealing that one. That is brilliant.
So
it might not work quite as well in the UK.
Yeah.
We'll try.
Office conversions. Every mayor I talk to in the United States, Republican or Democrat, when you say, are you struggling with what to do with empty office buildings? Their eyes light up and they said, if you've got a solution for that, right? And some of that zoning, we're building a $50 million capital fund to do office conversions to housing. We have 1 billion square feet of empty office space in the US, and that's just the officially vacant, right? There's a lot of rented office space that is sitting vacant. So there's a set of places I think you can go that really start to build momentum that can have real impact, but are the sort of small end of the wedge to be able to get the momentum to start to do bigger things.
We've got about 1 million square foot of empty office space in the centre of my city, which we're trying to convert into or build new flats in at the moment. And mostly it'll be taking. It's not high enough either. I'm thinking about 15,000 flats. There's this sort of interesting, Milton Keynes is a new town where I'm from. There's this interesting myth that has grown up in Milton Keynes that when it was originally built, nothing should be taller than the tallest tree. So we get similar criticisms whenever we try to build new, nice, pretty, tall, densified areas in the centre of the city, to which my council leader has come up with an ingenious solution, which is he's trying to get a tree planted on the top of one of the tall buildings he's built to solve some of those problems.
Guess what? The office buildings are already there, right?
Yeah.
And we do the retail, right? Retail was changing before COVID, and it's been accelerated. So we're doing a lot of work on converting old strip malls and shopping malls to housing. There's lots of opportunity out there.
Yeah. I think I'd agree with you as well on sort of, I'm not sure we can quite afford incremental change necessarily, but the importance of you just have to have the political confidence sometimes. I'm sure you have some of these conversations with some of your local councillors as well in order to see through difficult periods where development is going to be unpopular. I mean, some of the ones I see in you're never going to be able to necessarily get support at all moments of development when some of the conspiracy theories start up, or for me in particular, and a lot of urban extensions in my patch, it's the moment you cut down the hedgerows and you see the diggers in the mud behind, and that's the real emotional point for people. But actually, very, very few, over a period of time, often some of the new developments in my city are some of the most popular, well-loved bits of the city because of the brilliant things that have come with it. So obviously you need to build good, you need to build beautiful, you need to ensure local infrastructure comes along, but I think we all need to, as local political leaders have the bravery in order to see through some of the difficult political moments that will come up as new development happens and is just an inevitable part of the process.
Yeah. The other thing, I just want to go back to this question about the balance here and what the sweet spot is, because I think what there is a lot of political consensus around, a lot of bipartisanship, is deregulation, right? It is loosening the rules, it is making it faster and easier to build. When you come to actually spending money on housing, that coalition starts to fray in the United States. This is why the tax credit is so powerful. It's one thing I would say, because it truly is a bipartisan solution that's had staying power in the US. And we are getting people to vote for it at the same time that the Trump administration is proposing to cut our already too low rental assistance by 40% nationally. So where I find the sweet spot is if you can create significant market-related incentives to increase the investment in affordable housing to get to lower income folks and to balance those, you get, for example, what we call inclusionary zoning, right? Okay, we're going to allow people to build, we're going to increase the density, but we're going to make sure that a significant share of that housing is affordable from the moment it's built, right? I would also say we've seen and this was certainly true in New York, a very progressive, very democratic city. We just got a City of Yes zoning proposal done, which had many different aspects to it. But the single driving force was that every community should contribute to affordable housing. And while it is hard to say this in the US right now, that's a racial equity message as well, right? We shouldn't just have lower income communities of color that are seeing new development and adding. We should have every community, whatever density it is, whatever income level, should do their part, right? And that, I think, for progressives has been a traditional driving force of many of these reforms. And having a kind of balanced strategy like that so that every community is contributing, whether it's accessory dwelling units in single family neighborhoods or higher density in others, I think that is a really important part of creating that sweet spot that you're talking about when building these kind of reforms.
Right, 3 more questions.
Harrison Miller with Lexington Communications. Shaun, as a fellow US-UK dual national, it's great to see you here strengthening the transatlantic relationship. In that spirit, I want to ask you both a question, which is, Shaun, what do you see about the UK NIMBY movement that you appreciate? And Chris, what is it about the abundance movement in the US that you appreciate?
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Rick Molling, I'm a valuation surveyor specialising in regional format for local development appraisals. I think it's obstacle that I've seen personally to building has not really been political will or NIMBYs have been cost. Prior to COVID, building was at £2,000 a square metre. Now we're looking closer to £4,000 a square metre. When we're relying very heavily on the private sector to build using other grants or tax initiatives, how are we going to encourage them to build because they need to make a profit?
Right, I can see 2 more questions, so if you're very quick, we'll take them both.
Hi, my name is Vincenzo. Very quick question. Given that it's art of priorities alongside incentives, and the fact that somewhere like the UK, and I'm sure the US shares this, there are numerous problems in particular housing, whether that is supply, cost. Where does quality and choice come into that? And where do you place that in terms of what you're trying to achieve and what people should expect from the housing that they have access to?
And finally, competing for the big prize.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Lewis Bailey here. So you mentioned about empty office buildings. I actually work for a company that does data on empty office buildings. If you look at most major cities, it's about a third of the offices that people claim are fully occupied are actually occupied. We find the biggest blockers to people downsizing their office space that are not junior members of staff. It will be people in positions such as yourself, Shaun, CEO, saying, "But I love the office. It's fantastic." How can we, as politicians, whatever, legislators, actually make a difference and say, actually, provide an incentive for people to downsize their offices as well as downsizing their homes, to free up the space to build more homes?
Which of those do you want to take?
Should we take them in order?
No, however you want to take them.
Okay.
Cost of build. Well, what do you appreciate about the fantastic work people like me are doing? You can start with that one if you like. Cost of building.
We begin with that and end with that?
Yeah, if you like. Yeah, well, let's end with that one. Cost of building, which I think is probably slightly more of a UK-centric question, so I'm happy to take that.
No, it's not.
Is it not? Okay, fine. Quality and what should be expected of hoving, and then that point at the end there on empty office spaces. Do you want to take those three, and then we'll finish on the movements?
So cost of building has been a huge contributor to that housing affordability crisis in the US. There's no question. We saw a massive run up in costs during COVID, supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. And first, cost is very directly related to the regulatory and other restrictions that we see. So give you a very specific example. In the US, the productivity of home building is lower than it was 50 years ago. Now, in case you hadn't noticed, there's been a small invention since 50 years ago, which is called the computer. And we've digitized and made more productive just about every industry on earth, except for home building.
Yeah.
And it is stunning. And we now have, in the US at least, a massive amount of investment going into new construction technology, modular homes, a range of others. So I think there are ways to bring down the costs, even despite the global supply chain and other issues that we have. And to be very specific about this is something that we do at Enterprise Community Partners. We run a Housing Affordability Breakthrough Challenge every year where we raise philanthropic dollars to award millions of dollars in prizes to promising new initiatives and technologies. We have a modular housing system that won a big award in Texas, which we're now trying to spread across the country. In Texas, they have a law that says you can have a housing inspector come into the factory and inspect before you close up the walls, and you can then place that unit in any county in Texas. In Arkansas, they don't have that law. And so you have to leave the walls open in the factory, transport the unit to the site in the county, and then have the county inspector come and inspect and then close up the walls, right? So we also have thousands of different building codes, plumbing codes, electrical codes across the United States. So there are a broad set of reasons that the cost of housing is high, some of which are solvable, and some of which aren't. But there is no question in my mind that the regulatory challenges, the time delays, the uncertainty, and many of these regulatory and other code issues fundamentally contribute to the cost.
And they interact as well, right? Like the reason that we haven't been able to get an MMC factory up and going properly in the UK at any level of scale is because you don't build a factory if suddenly Michael Gove's going to lose a by-election, have a panic and stop house building in Britain, right? You need to have that level of certainty over time. And hopefully the changes we've started to make can give that certainty and therefore kickstart making this process more efficient.
Yeah. So housing quality, interestingly, when I started doing this work 3 decades ago, housing quality and affordability sort of competed to be the worst problems in housing in the US. Housing affordability now is overwhelmingly the challenge. In general, and I will say in general, because if you go to Indian country, if you go on to a tribal community, you'll see terrible housing conditions in many rural areas around the US, and certainly in places like Detroit and other, there are still places where you have concentrated issues around housing quality. But in general, we have many fewer housing quality issues than we used to. And I do think I would be a fan of de-emphasizing certain regulatory requirements around housing quality in order to bring down costs. For example, the level of inspections that we require in our housing voucher program and others, huge amount of administrative cost, gets fewer private developers willing to participate in the programs because we are such sticklers about the frequency and the level of hassle that come out of those inspections, as an example. I would be willing to say we should allow smaller housing units, right? Shared kitchens or other things. Given the level of homelessness that we have, I think we need to be looking at creative shared housing situations, single room occupancies, and others that are not allowed in a lot of places. So size is one aspect of quality that I think is overregulated in the US.
I agree with some of those points here in the UK, but I've got to get re-elected. So no, I think one thing that we do have to remember is in all of the debates about regulation is that every house you stop getting built is somebody stuck in something that's almost certainly worse than what you are building, and getting that balance right needs to be forefront in our mind, not trying to ensure that what we're building is perfect, top tier all of the time, because it's not always going to be. It's not always feasible.
Yeah. And to go back to the conversation we had earlier, like in your council housing, we do have huge housing quality problems in our public housing. And that is largely a lack of resources.
It's the climate point as well. I mean, we talk about that, it's often seen as this debate as being building versus nature, building versus, the climate cost of that. We have here in the UK some of the oldest housing stock in Europe, and that is leaking. We are heating people's homes for most of that heat to go out of old doors, old windows, badly insulated roofs, partly because our housing stock is so old.
Yeah, and heat pumps, there's a range of technological advancements in the last couple of years that have really, we're the biggest climate organization in affordable housing in the US. We do a huge amount of work on this. We think we have strategies that we've employed all over the country that can bring down the cost of utilities on average by up to $3,000 a family, depending on whether you also include an electric vehicle and other pieces. But this is not you've got to spend more to be green. You actually are really lowering housing.
I don't know what the maths is in the US, but most of this stuff in the UK is a 5-year payoff now, which is remarkable. Office build, office block, regen, then we'll say nice things about each other.
Yeah. So, look, we clearly have a challenge around which buildings can be. There are lots of physical issues around converting buildings, right? If you've got old office buildings, they're relatively easy to convert. More modern office buildings with very large floor plates can be very, very expensive, right? So I don't want to underestimate the kind of architectural and construction challenges around this, but I also agree that there is a cultural challenge here. And I think it will take leadership. I've been disappointed in our mayor in New York, and I've been disappointed with some business leaders who are unwilling to adapt to, or willing to say, we are going to be 2 or 3 days in the office, right? So I am a believer that we are not going back, and we shouldn't go back to 5 days in the office. We also have to go farther than that, because even if you're coming in 3 days, you're still occupying the same amount of office space all week. It's not like you can say, oh, come live in our offices 2 days a week and go live somewhere else the other days of the week, right? So what it's going to take is creative approaches to shared office, to working within companies to say, we're going to have certain groups in on some, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around how you create systems that allow this to happen. But the other thing I would just say, because there is already a lot of empty office space, is part of this is a fundamental economic problem. And I say this with all due respect, there are a bunch of developers here. Developers are the last people in the world that often want to face reality. And if you've got a property that's worth $100 million 1 year ago, that's now worth $10 million, the last thing you want to do is recognize that loss. And if you're a bank, there's a lot of challenges around recognizing those losses, right? I lived through the mortgage crisis in the US, right? Those have systemic financial implications. But we've got to get to a point where the pricing of these assets reaches a point where they're economically feasible to redevelop them at housing. And that is a big challenge in this market as well, at least in the US. I won't speak for the UK, but I would imagine developers aren't that different here from in the US, and banks as well.
And I mean, you've spent the last 24 hours around a lot of the YIMBY movement, including, I hope, most people here this evening. How have you found that experience? How do you find the energy that we're hopefully building here in the UK behind some of this agenda?
Yeah. So I want to reiterate the point I made earlier, which is one of the things that I am inspired by is, as a former budget director, your budget reflects your values. And I'm not predicting what's going to be in the review tomorrow, but the fact that you do make available to everyone who needs it, who's income qualified, a housing benefit is something that I think we are a long way away from in the US, and that is a critical foundation. And having met with members of at least two of your three parties in the last couple days, I have seen an enormous amount of alignment around the need to do this. It has not felt like an ideological debate. It has not felt like there is a fundamental disagreement about housing being a human right and something that you are all committed to doing. So I applaud you for that, and I am encouraged by it. I think the fundamental question for us in the US and for you is finding the political will to do everything that's necessary to the scale of this crisis. To go back where we started this conversation, and my old boss, President Obama, used to say to us all the time, a crisis is a terrible thing, but it is also a terrible thing to waste. And I think each of us needs to leave tonight looking ourselves in the mirror and asking, are we going to waste this crisis, or are we actually going to step up at the scale, at the intensity, at the level of commitment that's necessary to actually solve this crisis? It is solvable. We should not throw up our hands, and I've seen an enormous amount of will from you, from many of your colleagues, to do that. But every one of us has the responsibility to be part of that answer. Building the political will to do this, as we talked about earlier, is not easy, and it is not for the faint of heart.
No, I think that's a similar thing, certainly to how I've felt a lot over the past 12 months. Like, I am very optimistic about this country's future. I'm certain our brightest days are in front of us. But that will only be true if we grapple with the scale of the economic problems that we have been facing. Ultimately, unlike the US, our economy has not really grown in the UK for the last 20 years. And that means that there's not enough money for all of the public services that we need. There's not enough money for social affordable homes. It means that there's thousands of pounds out of the pay packets of working people that would otherwise have been there. And fundamentally, this country cannot afford another lost decade. And that means that we, right across government, from our planning system to our regulatory system to our general approach, needs to be as bold and as radical as possible in order to avoid that happening. I think there's certain lessons that we can learn from the successes of the movement in the US to ensure that happens. But the most important thing, for political reasons, because we're staring, a government in the face with potentially a Nigel Farage reform government, which scares a lot of us. And they're going to take this country in a really scary direction if they win. So there's a real political cost. But actually, when we think about the future of our National Health Service that we hold dear, how we can continue to support our pensioners in the UK, how we can continue to support that housing benefit system, all of that is going to start to get taken off the table in the next 10 years, one by one, unless we can solve this big fundamental economic problem. And in my view, it is only through the YIMBY agenda, it is only through the abundance agenda, it is only by being bold in backing that agenda that we are going to be able to do this in the UK. And optimistic that we've got a government that is pushing us to do so. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you for coming over. It's been brilliant to spend the last 24 hours with you. Thank you to Rix. Thank you to Rix for hosting us this evening. Thank you to Adam and the YIMBY Initiative for sponsoring. And have a wonderful rest of your evening. Cheers. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Who gets Sorry. Oh, sorry. Most important bit. I mean, you can't beat having Angela Rayner as your wallpaper, so we'll pass the bill along to John this evening. Thank you.